The tale begins with Brian Williams, a seasoned ace pilot of the Terran Space Fleet, whose mission took an unexpected turn, catapulting him into an uncharted region of the galaxy. A sudden malfunction sent his ship spiraling out of control, and with systems failing rapidly, Brian could only watch as the stars turned into a blur, and his once mighty vessel became little more than a hunk of metal hurtling toward an unknown world. The crash was violent, the impact throwing him into unconsciousness as his ship plummeted to the surface of a planet that, as far as human records showed, had never been charted. When Brian awoke, he found himself surrounded by a crowd of curious reptilian humanoids, creatures that, despite their primitive appearance, seemed intelligent. They regarded him with an expression that was all too familiar, one he had seen in the faces of countless soldiers and civilians back on Earth, a mixture of awe, fear, and reverence. The language barrier was immediate, but there was no mistaking the way they bowed their heads and chanted in guttural tones. These beings were worshiping him. As his head throbbed and his vision blurred from the concussion, Brian's first coherent thought was one of disbelief. He wasn't a god, he was a man, a pilot stranded on a foreign world, separated from his fleet by who knew how many light years. But to these beings with their spears and stone tools, his survival suit, his wrecked ship, and the technology within it might as well have been divine artifacts. For days they cared for him, bringing him strange fruits and roots, nursing his wounds, and keeping a vigilant watch over him as if he were a holy relic. Brian struggled with the situation, knowing that to disabuse them of their beliefs could lead to fear or hostility, yet he was uncomfortable with the pedestal they had placed him on. The village where he found himself was rudimentary, huts made of wood and leaves, fires that barely smoked, and tools that belonged to a civilization still in its Stone Age. As Brian's strength returned, he began exploring the village, learning more about these beings whom he came to know as the Remans. Their reptilian forms, with scales that ranged from green to a deep red, glistened in the sun, their eyes sharp and intelligent despite their technological backwardness. The Remans had a simple culture, one rooted in their close connection to the land and their belief in the gods of the sky. Beings who they believed would one day descend from the heavens to bring them wisdom and protect them from the dangers of the universe. They spoke in a language that was harsh on the ears, full of clicks and hisses, but Brian's military training in linguistics allowed him to pick up the basics quickly. He learned that they believed his arrival was a prophecy fulfilled, that he was the sky god who had come to lead them into a new age. The more he learned, the more uncomfortable Brian became with his role. He was no god, and he had no desire to be worshipped. But as the days turned to weeks, he realized that he was stuck here, at least for the foreseeable future. His ship was beyond repair, the damage too extensive for the rudimentary tools at his disposal. Even the communication systems were fried, leaving him with no way to call for help. The realization hit him hard. He was marooned on this primitive world with little hope of rescue. Yet Brian was not one to give up easily. He might be stranded, but he was still a soldier, and soldiers adapted. He began to take a more active role in the village, helping where he could. The Remans were eager to learn from their sky god, and Brian found himself teaching them the basics of machinery, mathematics, and science. He showed them how to make simple tools more efficient, how to use leverage and basic engineering principles to improve their daily lives. But even as he taught, a dark shadow loomed on the horizon. One day, as Brian was working on a makeshift forge, attempting to create more durable tools, the village was rocked by a distant explosion. The ground trembled and the sky darkened as a massive Zorgan warship broke through the clouds, its thrusters scorching the air as it descended toward the planet's surface. The Zorgan Empire was known throughout the galaxy as a ruthless conqueror, a civilization that expanded by subjugating other worlds and enslaving their populations. Brian's blood ran cold as he recognized the ship's design. He had encountered Zorgan forces before, and their reputation was well-deserved. The Remans, unaware of the true nature of the threat, looked to Brian for guidance. To them, this was another sign, a test from the gods. But Brian knew better. This was not a divine test, but a prelude to invasion and slaughter. The Zorgan Empire had found this planet, and it would not rest until it had stripped it of its resources and left its inhabitants either dead or in chains. Brian's first instinct was to flee, to find a way to survive on his own, but as he looked at the Remans, he knew he couldn't abandon them. They were a peaceful, kind-hearted people, and without his help, they would be wiped out. He had to do something, but what could one man do against the might of an entire Zorgan fleet? As the Zorgan warship landed, disgorging legions of armored soldiers, Brian made his decision. He would not run. He would stand and fight. The Remans had no concept of war on the scale that was about to descend upon them, but Brian did. He had seen it before, and he knew what needed to be done. He gathered the Reman warriors, their faces painted with fear and uncertainty, and began to train them in the art of war. They were hunters, skilled with spears and bows, but they had never faced an enemy like the Zorgans, an enemy with energy weapons and armored vehicles, an enemy that would show no mercy. Brian taught them how to fight in the shadows, to use their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. He showed them how to set traps, to use hit-and-run tactics that could disrupt the more advanced Zorgan forces. The Remans, eager to prove themselves to their sky god, took to the training with a fervor that surprised even Brian. They were quick learners, their minds sharp and adaptable. As the days passed, the village was transformed into a fortress, with trenches, barricades, and hidden defenses that would give even the Zorgans pause. Brian knew it wouldn't be enough. The Zorgan war machine was relentless, and once it started, it wouldn't stop until the planet was under its control. But he also knew that the Remans had something the Zorgans didn't, a cause worth fighting for. The first clash between the Remans and the Zorgans was brutal. The Zorgans, confident in their superior technology, advanced in tight formations, their energy weapons cutting through the jungle as they marched toward the village. But Brian had prepared the Remans well. They struck from the shadows, their arrows tipped with plasma-forged heads that pierced Zorgan armor. They set off traps that sent Zorgan soldiers flying, their screams echoing through the trees. For a moment, it seemed as though the Remans might actually have a chance. But then the Zorgan commander, a ruthless tactician named Captain Zoltar, ordered his troops to regroup and deploy their heavy artillery. Massive plasma cannons were brought to bear, leveling entire sections of the jungle and obliterating the Reman defenses. The tide of the battle shifted, and Brian realized that they were losing. The Remans fought valiantly, but they were no match for the sheer firepower of the Zorgan forces. Brian knew that if they didn't retreat, they would all be slaughtered. With a heavy heart, he ordered the Remans to fall back to the village's central keep, the most fortified position they had. The Zorgans pressed their advantage, but as they reached the keep, they were met with a new wave of resistance. Brian had saved his best fighters for this moment, and the Remans fought with a desperation born of the knowledge that they were fighting for their very survival. But even as they held the line, Brian knew it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. As the battle raged on, Brian received a transmission on his suit's emergency frequency. It was a signal from deep space. A Terran fleet was in the sector, and they had detected the energy signature of his crashed ship. They were on their way. Brian's heart leapt at the news, but he knew that the Remans couldn't hold out until the fleet arrived. They needed to buy more time. With a heavy heart, Brian made a decision that would change the course of the battle. He ordered the Remans to retreat into the mountain caves that surrounded the village, leaving the keep to the Zorgans. The Remans hesitated, unwilling to leave their sky god behind, but Brian was firm. "I will stay and hold them off," he told them. "You must survive. The fleet is coming, but you need to live to see it." With tears in their eyes, the Remans obeyed, disappearing into the caves as Brian prepared for a last stand. The Zorgans, seeing the retreat, advanced on the keep with renewed vigor. Brian, alone in the central tower, watched as they closed in. He knew he couldn't hold them off for long, but he didn't need to. He activated the last of the traps he had set, explosives rigged to the keep's foundations. As the Zorgans breached the outer walls, Brian detonated the charges, bringing the tower down on top of them. The explosion rocked the battlefield, sending debris flying in all directions. The Zorgans were thrown into disarray, their advance halted as they scrambled to regroup. In the chaos, Brian slipped away, using the confusion to make his way to a hidden passage that led into the mountains. He was battered and bruised, his suit's power reserves nearly depleted, but he was alive. As he reached the safety of the caves, he was met by Ector, the Riemann leader who had become his closest ally. Ector's eyes were wide with relief, and he clasped Brian's hand tightly. "We thought you were lost," Ector said, his voice choked with emotion. Brian shook his head. "Not yet," he replied, his voice grim. "But we're not out of this yet. The fleet is coming, but we need to hold out a little longer." The Riemanns, though exhausted and wounded, rallied at the news. They had seen their sky god survive the impossible, and their faith in him was stronger than ever. For the next few days, they prepared for the final assault, using the time bought by Brian's sacrifice to fortify the caves and set new traps. The Zorgans, now aware that they were facing a determined and resourceful enemy, took their time preparing for the final push. Captain Zoltar, enraged by the loss of his troops and the destruction of the keep, vowed to crush the Riemanns and their sky god once and for all. The final battle began at dawn, with the Zorgan forces launching a full-scale assault on the mountain caves. They brought everything they had: artillery, air support, and wave after wave of infantry. The Riemanns, under Brian's command, fought back with everything they had. The caves became a death trap for the Zorgan soldiers, with traps and ambushes turning the narrow passages into kill zones. But despite their best efforts, the Riemanns were slowly being pushed back. The Zorgans were too many, their technology too advanced. Brian knew that it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. Just as all hope seemed lost, the sky above the battlefield was torn apart by a series of explosions. The Terran fleet had arrived. 3 massive warships descended from the heavens, their weapons blazing as they unleashed a torrent of firepower on the Zorgan forces. The Zorgans, caught completely off guard, were decimated. Their ships were blown out of the sky, their ground forces torn apart by the Terran assault. The Riemanns, seeing the arrival of the true sky gods, were filled with renewed hope. They surged out of the caves, joining the Terran forces in driving the Zorgans from their world. The battle was fierce, but with the arrival of the fleet, the outcome was never in doubt. The Zorgans were routed, their once mighty war machine shattered. Captain Zoltar, realizing that the battle was lost, attempted to flee, but his ship was caught in the crossfire and destroyed. As the dust settled, Brian stood on the battlefield, surrounded by the wreckage of the Zorgan forces. He was exhausted, his body aching from the battle, but he was alive. The Riemanns, their faces shining with gratitude, gathered around him, their eyes filled with awe. To them, he was still a sky god, a divine being who had saved them from destruction. But Brian knew the truth. He was just a man who had done what he had to do to survive. As the Terran fleet landed, its soldiers and officers disembarking to take control of the situation, Brian was reunited with his comrades. Colonel Hawkins, the fleet's commander, greeted him with a grin. "Well, I'll be damned," Hawkins said, clapping Brian on the shoulder. "When we picked up that distress signal, we thought we were going to be rescuing some poor bastard from pirates. Didn't expect to find one of our own leading an alien resistance." Brian chuckled, though the sound was tinged with exhaustion. "It's a long story, sir," he replied, glancing at the Riemanns who stood nearby, their eyes still wide with wonder. "But I'm glad you're here." Over the next few days, the Terran forces helped the Riemanns secure their world, driving the last of the Zorgan forces from the planet and setting up defenses to ensure they wouldn't return. Brian, now fully aware of his role as a bridge between the Riemanns and humanity, worked closely with both sides to ensure a smooth transition. The Riemanns, once a primitive society, were now on the path to becoming a technologically advanced civilization, thanks to the knowledge and tools that Brian and the Terran forces had provided. But even as peace returned to the planet, Brian knew that the battle was far from over. The Zorgan Empire was vast, and the defeat of one fleet would not stop them from coming back. The Riemanns needed to be ready, and Brian was determined to make sure they were. He stayed on the planet, continuing to train the Riemann warriors and working with the Terran engineers to build up their defenses. The Riemanns, for their part, were eager to learn. They had seen the power of technology and were determined to master it. Under Brian's guidance, they began building their own weapons, fortifying their cities, and even constructing their own spacecraft. It was a monumental task, but Brian was confident that they would succeed. The Riemanns were intelligent, resourceful, and driven by a desire to protect their world. They had been mistaken for gods, but now they were becoming something even more powerful, a united people capable of defending themselves against any threat. Months passed, and the Riemann civilization began to flourish. Their cities grew, their technology advanced, and their society became more organized. They were no longer the primitive beings that Brian had first encountered. They were a force to be reckoned with. But even as they grew stronger, Brian knew that the real test was yet to come. The Zorgan Empire would not forget their defeat, and they would return, stronger and more determined than ever. Brian spent his days preparing for that eventuality, working tirelessly to ensure that the Riemanns would be ready when the time came. He trained their soldiers, advised their leaders, and helped them build alliances with other nearby civilizations. He knew that the Riemanns couldn't stand alone against the full might of the Zorgan Empire, but with allies, they might have a chance. The Riemanns, for their part, were fiercely loyal to Brian. They still saw him as their sky god, even though he had long since told them the truth. To them, it didn't matter whether he was divine or not. He had saved them, taught them, and given them the tools to defend themselves. He was their leader, their protector, and their friend. As the first anniversary of the Zorgan defeat approached, the Riemanns held a grand celebration to honor Brian and the Terran fleet. They gathered in the central square of their capital city, which had grown from a simple village into a bustling metropolis. The buildings, now made of steel and glass, gleamed in the sunlight, and the air was filled with the sound of laughter and music. Brian stood on a raised platform, looking out at the sea of Riemann faces. He felt a deep sense of pride as he watched them, these people who had once been so primitive, now standing tall and proud, their eyes filled with hope for the future. Hector, who had become the leader of the Riemanns, stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice, once filled with uncertainty, was now strong and confident. "Today we celebrate not just our survival, but our rebirth," Hector said, his words carrying across the square. "We were once a people divided, but now we stand united, stronger than ever before. And we owe this new strength to our friend, our teacher, our sky brother, Brian Williams." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the city. Brian felt a lump form in his throat as he stepped forward to speak. "I'm no god," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I'm just a man who found himself in the right place at the right time. But what we've achieved here, we did together. You are no longer the people you were when I first arrived. You are warriors, builders, thinkers, and leaders. You are ready to face whatever challenges lie ahead." The cheers grew louder, and Brian felt a swell of pride. But even as he basked in the moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The Zorgan Empire was still out there, and they would not rest until they had avenged their defeat. As the celebration continued into the night, Brian slipped away to the command center. He had a job to do, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The Riemanns might be ready, but they were still vulnerable. They needed to stay vigilant, to keep building, keep learning, keep preparing. He spent the night poring over reports, analyzing data, and working with the Terran, advisors to strengthen the Riemann defenses. He knew that the Zorgan Empire wouldn't make the same mistake twice. When they returned, they would come with overwhelming force. They would bring their full might to bear, and the Riemanns would need every advantage they could get. Over the next few months, Brian's fears proved to be well-founded. The Zorgan Empire, furious at their defeat, began amassing a new fleet, one that dwarfed the previous invasion force. Spies within the Empire reported that they were planning a full-scale assault, one that would wipe the Riemanns off the map. The Riemann leaders, now fully aware of the threat, mobilized their forces. The cities were fortified, the armies trained, and the fleet prepared for battle. Brian worked around the clock, coordinating with the Terran fleet and their new allies, a coalition of civilizations that had joined the Riemanns in their fight against the Zorgan Empire. The final battle was inevitable, and Brian knew it would be the ultimate test of everything they had worked for. The day of reckoning arrived with the sight of the Zorgan fleet on the horizon, their massive ships blotting out the stars as they approached the Riemann homeworld. The Riemanns, now fully armed and ready, stood alongside their Terran and allied forces, waiting for the battle to begin. Brian stood on the bridge of the Riemann flagship, his eyes fixed on the enemy fleet. He knew that this would be the battle that decided the fate of the Riemanns, the battle that would determine whether they lived or died. The Zorgan fleet opened fire, their energy weapons lighting up the sky as they rained destruction down on the planet. The Riemann defenses, now bolstered by Terran technology, held firm, but the onslaught was relentless. The battle raged on for hours, with both sides taking heavy losses. The Riemann fleet, though smaller, fought with a ferocity that took the Zorgans by surprise. They used hit-and-run tactics, exploiting the terrain and their superior knowledge of the planet to outmaneuver the larger Zorgan ships. But despite their best efforts, the Riemanns were slowly being pushed back. The Zorgan fleet was simply too powerful, their numbers too great. It seemed as though the Riemann forces would be overwhelmed, when suddenly the tide of battle shifted. A massive explosion rocked the Zorgan fleet as one of their capital ships was destroyed. Brian, who had been coordinating the defense, looked up in shock as a new fleet appeared on the horizon. It was the Terran reinforcements, led by the flagship of the Terran Space Fleet. The Terrans had arrived just in time, their ships bristling with weapons as they launched a full-scale assault on the Zorgan fleet. The battle that followed was brutal, with both sides taking heavy losses. But with the Terran reinforcements, the Riemanns and their allies were able to push back the Zorgan forces. The combined might of the Riemanns, Terrans, and their allies proved too much for the Zorgan fleet, and one by one, the Zorgan ships were destroyed. Captain Zultar, the ruthless Zorgan commander, realized that he had lost. In a desperate bid to salvage something from the battle, he ordered his remaining ships to retreat. The Zorgan fleet, battered and broken, fled into the depths of space, leaving the Riemann homeworld in peace. The battle was over. The Riemanns had won. The cost had been high, many had died, and the planet had been scarred by the battle, but they had survived. The Zorgan Empire, once a seemingly unstoppable force, had been defeated. As the Riemanns celebrated their victory, Brian stood on the bridge of the flagship, looking out at the wreckage of the Zorgan fleet. He felt a deep sense of relief, but also a sense of loss. The battle was over, but the war had taken its toll. The Riemanns had been forced to fight, to kill, to become something they had never wanted to be. They had been mistaken for gods, but they were just people. People who had been thrust into a war they didn't ask for, people who had been forced to make impossible choices. Brian knew that the Riemanns would never be the same, but he also knew that they were stronger for it. They had proven that they could stand up to the might.